So now we're going to pick up, this is video 2 from March 16th. This is going to be Cold War in Asia again, but this time we're going to be covering the Korean War. So this is the next part of the notes. So, after World War II, Japan's former colony was divided at the 30th parallel. So here's what happens to Korea. Right when the war ends, Japan had owned Korea for the past 30 years. When the war ends, we invade Korea from the south. Because Russia had jumped in the war at the end, they invaded Korea from the north. So you have the Soviets occupying northern Korea, and you have us occupying South Korea. So basically just like what happens in Europe, neither side of us want to give up our parts of Korea, so we end up agreeing to a division. So both us and the Soviets agreed to divide up Korea in half because neither wanted to give up the other side, and of course for us it would violate containment. So it gets split at the 30th parallel. So at the 30th parallel is where Korea will be split apart due to this post-World War II condition. In 1949, both our forces and Soviet forces leave. So North and South Korea are left to run themselves by 1949, and we both leave, and we just both expect they're going to stay split apart like this forever, basically. The leader who's going to come around in North Korea is going to be Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung, this man right here. He is the grandfather of the current leader. The current leader is Kim Jong-un. Kim Il-sung was the father of Kim Jong-il, and then Kim Jong-il was the dad of Kim Jong-un, the current leader. So they've had a consistent communist dictatorship since the 1940s. Whereas South Korea has presidents and has more of a democracy, their guy is going to be named Syngman Rhee. So Syngman Rhee, this man right here, was the first leader. He was a conservative nationalist. So North Korea, communist. South Korea, not communist, more democratic. So North Korea, communist. South Korea, more democratic. Okay? But we all leave and we think that, okay, it's just going to basically run as is. So in 1950, on June 25th, the North Koreans invaded South Korea to the surprise of both us and the Soviets. So that's the invasion. That's when it starts. June 25th, 1950 is whenever North Korea invades South Korea, which is the start of the Korean conflict here, which had caught both us and the Soviets off guard when this happens. So Truman took immediate action to try to do containment here to keep North Korea out of South Korea. So he called a special session of the United Nations. This is going to be the first true test of the United Nations after it's been formed here, dealing with the international crisis. Also, too, remember we talked about the National Security Council. So Truman basically asked the National Security Council to help support South Korea and send troops in. But you think, well, what about the Soviets? The Soviets would probably not want this to happen, and the Soviets would boycott this. And so, luckily for us, the Soviets were, or they would veto it, excuse me. The Soviets boycotted the UN at the time, was boycotting the United Nations at the time because we had not recognized Communist China. So the Soviets weren't even there in the United Nations. And so they weren't there for us to recognize Communist China, essentially. Or Communist, for Communist China, excuse me. So, Soviets weren't there, so all the Security Council approved, and so we will be able to go to war here in South Korea. Now, here's the thing. This is our first, modern-day policing action that's going to take place, and that's how Truman sells it. This is the first war we don't really declare war here, because we basically send a lot of, thousands upon thousands of troops into into Korea, and there's no declaration of war. So basically what Truman says is that we're doing this as a police action. And so when he says this, Congress buys it, and Congress says okay. And so Congress authorizes and allows for Truman to use our forces in Korea, even though we're not going to ever actually declare war here. So we took advantage of the boycott from the Soviets over China, and we developed UN forces to go fight. We send in hundreds of thousands, like 500,000 soldiers. We send in hundreds of thousands of soldiers into Korea, most of which was American. So 90% of United Nations forces that go in to help South Korea are American. So it's pretty much an American war. And Americans make up the vast majority of the soldiers who go into South Korea. They put General Douglas MacArthur, so he's back again. General MacArthur is put in charge of UN forces. He was running Japan right across the way, and so they brought him over to become in charge of this attack into the Korea as a result. Congress did not declare war, but allowed Truman to use troops in a mere policing action. So this changed. So this in itself has changed the role of the executive branch, which obviously is going to be a big factor when we get to Vietnam, and then it'll be a big factor into modern day situations like the Gulf War, and then Iraq and Iran and all these different places in Afghanistan, because we haven't declared war since World War II, but we've had so many different wars since then where the president's been given a lot of power as the executive authority to go into these areas and take control of the situation. All right, so the counterattack. So if you look, the first few weeks, our forces get pushed way back. So like the UN forces do terrible in the first few weeks. So from June to September, our forces get pushed back all the way to here. So by September of 1950, we only occupy this small chunk, whereas North Korea is taking over the rest of Korea. So MacArthur does a surprise landing behind their lines at Incheon Bay. So September 15th, Incheon Bay, we do a surprise landing behind them. We come in and attack them from here and attack them from here. Half their guys surrender, the other half retreat. So half their forces surrender, the other half retreat back across the 30th parallel. So basically from September until the next few weeks, we're going to reclaim control of all of South Korea after MacArthur did his successful counterattack at Incheon Bay in September 1950. Now the question was, should we go past the 30th parallel? And pretty much, yes. I mean, all right. MacArthur was told yes, he thought it should be yes, so we pass the 30th parallel and go farther north and try to basically claim the north now since they attacked us. So now, from September to November, American and UN forces are heading up north, and now they're going to cross the 30th parallel and begin to go in to take over North Korea, taking over their capital, Pyongyang, and going farther north. So we get as far as here, very close to the Yalu River, the border between China and North Korea, by November 1950. So we get here by November 1950, and we're basically told to stop because we didn't want to get too close to where China was because we might provoke them. And MacArthur didn't listen to that. Like his guys over him told him, don't get too close to China or too close to the Yalu River. You might provoke the Chinese. But he didn't listen to that. So he basically went as far as he could, and he went too far. So after the counterattack, we push all the way up to the northern border, but because we got too close and because the Chinese and Mao didn't like the idea of having a democratic country right on the border, Mao sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers into North Korea to go fight. So in November of 1950, after we got too close to the border with China, about, I want to say it's 200,000 to 300,000 Chinese soldiers are now fighting to help protect North Korea. And so now the gate's going to swing again. So from November of 1950 until basically the springtime of 1951, you're going to see the Chinese pushing us back down. They're going to push us back down below the 30th parallel to Seoul, the capital of South Korea. We regain our footing and we push them back. So basically, we get pushed down below the 30th parallel, but by summer of 1951, we're back along this line here, and it's pretty much where the fighting is going to take place for the rest of the war. So fighting doesn't really move from the middle of Korea for the next 2 years of the war after it all gets settled once the Chinese get involved. But the Chinese overwhelmed us is the long and short of that. All right, Truman versus MacArthur. So MacArthur stabilized fighting near the 30th parallel after being pushed back by the Chinese. He called for an expanded war. He wanted the United Nations and he wanted Truman to declare war on China. He wanted to be able to go in and invade China, but not just invade China, also use nuclear weapons against China too. So he's calling for the use of nuclear weapons against China to help even the odds up because they have a much larger land force than we do. Truman warned him about making public statements about this, and basically all the generals over MacArthur said, no, we're not going to do this, as did Truman. And Truman said, be careful about making U.S. statements about this and criticizing U.S. policy, which he basically ignored. So he did some interviews with some journalists, and they used those interviews and published them back in America, which he didn't necessarily intend for them to get out, but they did. MacArthur thought he knew better. He had been running a government in Japan for the past 5-6 years, so he felt like he'd been running a better government than what was happening with Truman in America, so why not let him make better decisions as this general out here in the field? So he spoke out anyway and got in trouble. So in April of 51, Truman had to fire him for being insubordinate. So Truman had to fire Douglas MacArthur, this World War II hero, in April of 61. So April of 61, I'm sorry, 51. MacArthur gets fired for being insubordinate with the support of the Joint Chiefs. So Truman and the Joint Chiefs of Staff supported this decision. MacArthur returned home. He got a hero's welcome. He got a lot of parades thrown for him. A lot of Americans took his side in this event because it became national public news. You can see a picture of MacArthur and Truman here. It became national news. He even was invited to speak in front of Congress. So you see MacArthur getting a lot of praise, and Truman and the Democrats getting a lot of criticism as a result. Truman kind of waited for this all to die down. So basically, after a few weeks had passed and things had kind of subsided, Truman then comes on the radio and newspapers and basically states his case, why he fired him, why he felt like we shouldn't invade the Chinese, and so on and so forth. And then basically, by doing that, he won support back over to his side. So after a few weeks after MacArthur gets fired, Truman is able to win people back to his side once this is all said and done. So now the war continues onward without MacArthur being in charge, and this World War II hero kind of fades away because some people felt like MacArthur might be a opponent politically because he might run as a Republican eventually for president, and now he's going to basically fade away after this big scandal with Korea. So MacArthur will no longer be in the public eye after he leaves Korea. All right, the armistice, so the end of this conflict. So basically the war stayed in the same place for the next 2 years. From 1951 until 53, the war never really moved beyond the 30th parallel again, so it was at a stalemate. Peace talks began in July 51, but the police action dragged on until 53. Finally, under Eisenhower, the next president, an armistice was signed in June of 1953, where it ended the Korean conflict. Now, they technically only signed an armistice, and so officially the war has not ended. As of 2017, the war between North and South Korea is still happening, but they have a ceasefire. Neither side has declared peace. And so they create this highly militarized DMZ, demilitarized zone. So this demilitarized zone will be protected by both North and Korean forces. We have American forces there too. This is the most heavily guarded border in the world as of today, but there's still very much a tense relationship between North and South, and North is always trying to provoke the South with tests and everything else, but they have yet to fight since 1953. After Korea was done, we lost 54,000 Americans, which is pretty comparable to what we lost in Vietnam. So we lost about 54,000 Americans in Korea, which is a fairly high number. Even though this was not our official war or as well of a known war here. And you can see all kind of different images here from the war itself, some of the helicopters and guys fighting here in Korea as well. And I have a picture of the monument for Korea in Washington, D.C. as well too. All right, so the political consequences, this is where we're going to end the video for the notes for today. From the perspective of grand strategy, containment worked with Korea. Truman used the Korean conflict as justification to dramatically expand the military, which we talked about, back around 50-51. Because of Korea, we expanded the military to be like 20% of our GNP. We also built brand new jet bombers. We also put more soldiers in overseas stations and bases as a result. So now we have people stationed like in Europe. We have people stationed in Japan. People stationed in Korea. People stationed in the Philippines. All these different places we're going to have people stationed across the world, which for the most part we still do. Republicans were very critical of Truman, and they blamed Democrats for losing China. So containment worked for Korea, but it didn't work for China. So Republicans said that they were soft on communism, which is one of the reasons why Republicans win so many seats back in 1952. So 52 is when Eisenhower wins, and Republicans take seats back in Congress. And so you're going to see a big shift there happening too. So we're going to stop there. Tomorrow we're going to pick up the Red Scare. And then hope you had a good day. See you tomorrow. Don't forget to send me election information.